This is 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. In 1984, the writer Anthony Burgess selected his 99 favourite novels in English since the outbreak of the Second World War. Never short of an opinion about books, Burgess's list is typically idiosyncratic and invites closer attention, so we've invited some of the leading scholars, critics and writers to tell us more about each of the 99 novels. So read along with us as we explore a reading list created by one of the most original literary voices of the 20th century. In this episode, Andrew Biswell talks to writer and critic Bob Batchelor about The Coup by John Updike, a novel Anthony Burgess called a beautifully written, disturbing lyric composition. The Coup focuses on Hakim Felix Ellellou, the former dictator of Kush, a fictional Islamic state in Africa. He looks back on his life and his time as ruler and documents the American involvement in the political life of his country. Through double dealing and betrayal, the Americans are instrumental in inspiring a coup against Ellellou. John Updike was born in Reading, Pennsylvania in 1932. He published his first novel, The Poorhouse Fair, in 1959. He's perhaps best known for the 4 novels that deal with the adventures of Rabbit Angstrom, and for The Witches of Eastwick, which was adapted into a film in 1987. He won the Pulitzer Prize in 1991 for his novel Rabbit at Rest. He died in 2009. Bob Batchelor has written 16 books on subjects as wide as The Great Gatsby, Jim Morrison and the Doors, The Prohibition, and comic book writer Stan Lee. He's written extensively about John Updike, including the book John Updike, A Critical Biography. He's also presented the podcast series John Updike, American Writer, American Life. He's currently assistant professor in the Department of Communication, Media and Culture at Coastal Carolina University. He can be found online at bobbatchelor.com. For all of the relevant links, head to the description of this episode, where you can also find a list of all the books mentioned. Here's Andrew Biswell, who spoke to Bob Batchelor about The Coup by John Updike in September 2025.
Welcome, first of all, Bob. It's a great pleasure to have you here. And I wonder, first of all, if you could tell us about your first encounter with John Updike's writing, and indeed how perhaps your view of his work has changed as you've come to know that work better.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk about Updike. I had a very strange introduction to Updike in high school here in America. So I'm a young teenager. I had a teacher who was the guru of English and literature in our high school, and she was the one teacher that everybody wanted her blessing. And for some reason, she didn't like me. And like most smart alecky teenagers in the US, my reaction was to double down on being a smart aleck. And so she sent me to the back of the room one day, way back in the back of the classroom, while everybody else was rows ahead of me. And I looked over and she had an old-fashioned spinning paperback holder. And I was spinning that holder and I noticed a book with a basketball on the cover. And I was a high school basketball player. So I picked up that book. Everybody else in the class is ignoring me. It turned out to be Rabbit Run. And I took it home. I really, to be completely honest, I stole it from the teacher, put it in my backpack, took it home. I still have that copy. It's tattered and falling apart. It's very yellowed pages, but it set me off on a lifelong love affair with John Updike. Geographically, I grew up in a straight line 300 miles west of John Updike. So where he grew up in Pennsylvania, if you drew a straight line 300 miles, would be where I grew up in Pennsylvania. And what I found over the years is that Updike, even though he went off and lived in New England most of his life, he has what I call a Pennsylvania sensibility. And so that voice, I heard that voice all around me growing up. It was very comforting, but elevated in a way that I someday hope to write myself. And so that was my initiation into Updike through stealing this teacher's copy of Rabbit Run from the classroom. As the years have passed, I would say as an academic, I enjoy the way that Updike brings history to life through fiction. And so I have deep respect. I think that I see Updike as a little more critical than most scholars do. Updike is incredibly critical of the United States and its excesses in many of his books. As a writer, because I'm also a writer and I write primarily for general, or as we call trade audiences, I just love the beauty, the music of the words, the lyricism. I think I have a deep respect for Updike, who seemingly, whatever the study, and I don't know if you've spent much time reading Updike's nonfiction, but there are probably, if you stacked all of his nonfiction collections up, it'd be several thousand pages of published nonfiction. He seemed like he had a PhD in whatever subject. If he was talking about painting, talking about engineering, talking about a bridge somewhere in the middle of nowhere, he seemed to have a PhD. He's such an intelligent, smart, intellectually curious person. So that's how my admiration for Updike has grown over the years.
I'm glad you mentioned his nonfiction. I don't know all of it by any means, but the essays in Picked Up Pieces, I do remember reading, and like you, being astonished by the breadth of his knowledge and his interest, and perhaps that feeds into the novels as well. I mean, I know through reading his nonfiction that Nabokov is one of his great writers who he admires very much. And as you said, there's much more to it than that. Sometimes he wrote about sport or painting or whatever came into his ken. He was like a sort of Vesuvius of prose and poetry as well, as we know. So this particular novel, The Coup, I wonder, assuming that many people won't know it, how would you introduce that book to readers who weren't already familiar with it?
I would tell people who weren't familiar with The Coup, and that number would be large. Sadly, this is not a book in Updike's catalog that is widely known, I would estimate, even though it's powerful. I would say that it is Updike's view of American colonialism, neo-colonialism, and the role of the United States vis-a-vis the Soviet Union and the repeated attempts to colonialize and recolonialize those countries after Vietnam. And so it's very much specific to that era, that mid 1970s to 1980 era. So leading up to Ronald Reagan in the United States. So it's very much a historically specific novel, but I think that some of the deeper ideas in the novel are still important today. I think we still see echoes of these things today. Certainly, the way American ideology is exported through commerce, through arms, through art, through popular culture. So, I think it's an important book. I would hazard that most people have never heard of it in today's world. And it's not studied as much, I think, as it probably should be. Everybody loves the Rabbit novels. They should, because of the power. And Updike was stamped a American domestic culture author. And this was one of his, if not his first, wholesale attempt to break out of that shell. And I think it's been overlooked to some degree by Updike scholars. I think we should all be spending a little more time with The Coup and figuring out how it explains Updike a little better.
Thank you. I mean, we should say, I suppose, that the novel takes the form of a kind of confession written in both the first and the third person by the dictator of an African country called Kush or Kush. He's called Hakim Felix Ellellou, and he's a soldier, and he's very well traveled. He's been to America, and he brings that knowledge of America, and one of his wives is American as well, back to his point of origin. And very interesting dialogues between him and other prominent characters, the former king of the country, who he executes for political reasons, and then ends up in the same cell where the king has been held, and his various ministers and his various wives. So we've got a series of encounters with very strong characters. And one of the pleasures for me of reading this is that Updike's prose, his narrative voice, or the series of narrative voices within the novel, are so sharp and intelligent, as we'd expect from him, a person of great education, though the narrator of the novel is also complex and slippery in all kinds of ways. So I wonder if you could tell us whether or not, how far or how little, this novel, The Coup, resembles the other novels Updike was writing in the 1970s. This one came out, I think, between his novel Marry Me and Rabbit is Rich, which is part of the series that was very popular. So how is this either like or unlike the other novels that he wrote around this time?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. And as a cultural historian, these are the kind of things that keep me awake at night because I love the fact that this novel comes out 1978. It's a period in which I think if you step back and look at Updike, he is questioning a lot of things because he took a lot of criticism from other writers, both publicly and privately, for seeming to be on the administration side during the Vietnam War. And as if he were some rube that was just falling in line with the flag toters and the more conservative parts of the public who supported the Vietnam War, at least initially. And I think it was unfair, and it left him questioning himself and his thinking about the United States. I read somewhere one of the reviewers claimed, or maybe Updike himself actually, he didn't talk a lot about the coup in comparison to other novels, but his reaction to the Nixon administration is encompassed within in the coup. And you can see that in the way that he's taken, say, the criticism of the early Updike novels and ratcheted up a bit. So it's become a little more pointed, a little more jagged, and he's able to put these ideas and words that I think that he's feeling in the mouth of Ellellou and make it a little more sharp than perhaps anybody would have expected from him at the time. So I think it, culturally it fits right in with those novels and in this late 70s, pre 1980 period for him where I believe he's also divorced his first wife at this time. He spent the first little bit of time. He wasn't single for very long, but he's a single man after a decades long marriage. He did move out of his family home. So there's a lot of things going on, both for the United States, Updike personally, how he's seen professionally. And with Updike, there's always that lingering thought of, I'm going to die soon. I better get it all out on the table. So I think this fits right in well with his other novels of the period.
He'd also traveled, I think, in Africa as part of the research for the book. And I guess that's important too. It's not an entirely an imaginary place. It's a place that he'd visited and thought about. Did he have it in mind to write a novel when he went there? Or was it like an incidental gift that came out of that journey, do you think?
Yeah, I think that trip, and I believe he goes to Africa with his first wife in 1973 as part of the Fulbright scholarship. He goes to Ghana, Nigeria, Tanzania, Kenya, and Ethiopia. And he's giving lectures there. He did go on a safari in which he was quick to point out was a photo taking safari. You can't imagine Updike killing something with a gun. That's not John Updike. He also, and I think this is a bit underlooked, for The New Yorker, he becomes kind of the house reviewer for non-American novelists. And they had started doing a little African novel reviewing, and some of that would fall to Updike. And so he was familiarizing himself with the Africa that was presented through the eyes of its novelists, then sees it firsthand. So there's a lot of things percolating. And we know from the author note at the beginning of the coup that Updike's done deep research. And so, again, going back to his intellectual curiosity, the guy is just voracious in his preparation to write, and then so lyrical when it actually comes out. So I think that those trips and that research definitely are the backbone of this work.
Anthony Burgess, in his long review of the coup, he describes it very approvingly, actually, as a fat volume of poetry, he says, and also an enormous verse movement modestly disguised as prose. And with that in mind, I wonder how far you think it helps the reader to know that Updike was a poet. But indeed, what else we find here once we've got beyond the surface of the book and its very impressive literary style.
Yeah, I think that Updike's literary prowess is strong throughout the book. I'll just read one little part to give listeners an idea, because this is when Ellellou is about to have the king beheaded. In today's world, it would be very action oriented, like a Tom Cruise movie. You would see the blade and it would be very different. But so this is Updike, how Updike wrote leading up to this scene. In this life woven of illusions and insubstantial impressions, it's gratifying to encounter heft, to touch the leaden center of things that is at the center of B, the rock in Plato's cave. I thought of an orange. I lifted the sword high so that the reflection from its flashing blade hurtled around the square like a hawk of lethal brightness, slicing the eyes of the crowd and the hardened clay of the facades, the shuttered, fearful windows, the blanched pegged walls, and squat aspiring minaret of the mosque of the day of disaster. That's pretty poetic stuff there for a sword being raised in what's going to happen. A beautiful way to describe something that's as awful as one could imagine. So lyrical, musical, and I think that's something that it's easy to understand why such a music based artist and lyrical based artist like Burgess enjoyed Updike's writing.
And more than that, he was emboldened to set out some of the prose as verse in his review. And towards the beginning of the book, there's a particular description of the landscape, and Burgess is quite sure that he's reading, he says, verse disguised as prose, and he gives you about 14 lines from the novel, and he's right about that. There is a regular rhythm behind these utterances and these sentences. The piece diminished to a winding track, treacherously pitted, strewn with flinty scrabble that challenged well the metal of our Michelin steel-belted radials. Distances grew bluish as we rose higher, etc. And this goes on. You can see why Burgess is excited about this as a literary stylist, as a fellow practitioner in that art. He goes on to say, Burgess, that the coup is a true statement about neo-colonialism and the intractabilities of Africa. And maybe you can tell us more about some of the political meanings and political resonances of the novel.
Yeah, I think that the neo-colonialism is a great framework for thinking about the coup and thinking about what Updike had seen in his travels 5 years earlier. He'd had 5 years to stew over what he had seen and put it into a new form. So that's very interesting. The neo-colonial aspect is the United States' fervent hope, certainly in the 70s, in this era, to provide undernourished countries aid, arms, commerce, and what seems on the surface as help is actually a way to infuse ideology, culture, pop culture, American views of democracy. So I think what Updike is saying through the coup is that we're in a conundrum when it comes to neocolonialism. The people of the nation may need the aid, and the humanitarian aspect of aid is good, but the ideology and the forced ideology is corrupting and manipulative. And so Ellellou is a representation of how his country is stuck between these two competing superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union, almost de facto using aid as warfare in African nations that also are modernizing but still have distinct loyalties to tribes, people, and heritage. They're wrestling with their post colonial identity. The French play a very important intellectual role as the people of Kush are breaking free. There's the idea of corruption and military power, and also revolutionary ideology. So, what I think is happening here is Updike is astutely asking us to weigh these various options in a way that brings satire, language, and intellect to bear on ideas like power, ideology, and moral ambiguity. And I don't know what more you could want from in that era or in that time frame from a novelist who is interpreting the things that they see in front of them.
And of course, giving all that a dramatic form. I mean, it's not an abstract novel as some of Saul Bellow's writing could be. He'll break off what he's talking about. He'll give you a big essay on politics or feminism or whatever it is. But it seems to me that all of the political content in the coup is really well integrated into the story that's unfolding. And it's a very effective, very gripping way of doing that, it seems to me. So Updike also here, it seems to me, articulates his profound skepticism about these ideologies you've mentioned, systems of government, and indeed the idea of revolutionary change. So, do you think we should see it as a book with a message, or is it more complicated than that?
I think in this complex intersection of these ideas that we've been talking about, it definitely has a message. But I think that it also, in the complications of both the plot and the thinking in the novel, show us that there are no easy answers. So it's not a solely political tract or a piece of propaganda, but it is critical, but it doesn't point the finger at just one entity within the larger story. So I think that's what keeps it from going too far or dipping into propaganda. So I think it is a message, but the message is so complex and has so many historical and contemporary aspects to it that reading the book is almost an exercise in critical thinking. It's forcing the reader or asking the reader to reconsider everything that they think about the United States, Africa, the Soviet Union, the French, colonial powers, history up to that point. So I think it really goes far beyond just a piece of propaganda.
From what you're saying, one of the other points that occurs to me is I wonder how this book would be responded to by the America First people. It seems to describe such a different attitude to America's place in the world, and it is, it's a book that, though set in Africa, reflects a lot on America and on French colonialism and on other kinds of revolutionary and colonialist behavior. Do you think it's describing a historical situation, or are there contemporary resonances here as well?
Yeah, I think that's a wonderful question and a great way to look at the book, and why I think that it's important and should be studied more by people like me who are interested in Updike and want to keep his flame alive for younger generations. If you're looking for rationales to or reasons to criticize Updike, which certainly there are pockets of large pockets of people in the United States that would want to do that with such a book, those are easy to find. Page 3, America, that fountainhead of obscenity and glut. Page 27. Unlike the Americans who wandered everywhere like children, absurdly confident of being loved. Those are two quotes that I pulled from the book specifically because they're so contemporary. And depending on your political leaning, you would see those two phrases vastly differently. So, for that alone, I think that the book has incredible relevance today because we're still dealing with these issues. It may be US and China, in Africa specifically, more at the current time, but the exercises in power through aid, arms, to espouse ideology and culture is still happening. And so, in that sense, this portrays a historical picture of how this development has played out as we're now getting closer to the 50th anniversary. Before we know it, it'll be the 50th anniversary of the coup. And that's quite immaculate that so many things 50 years later are still at the forefront of international diplomacy. So I think it's a great question and a fantastic reason to look at this book again. I could see this as a wonderful companion for an international relations or political science class, a history class on the contemporary world. And I don't know if you follow this much, but it seems to me there's now an effort, or perhaps historians have now said that the 80s are okay to study as history. And perhaps as the 1980s becomes more of a historical perspective or a historical subject matter, books like The Coup and some of Updike's other works will come back into favor as almost eyewitness accounts of what was happening at a certain moment in time.
It is a very quotable book as well. I found I was doing what you've done as I've gone through it. I'm just jotting down these very memorable and resonant phrases. Page 40, for example, humanitarian catastrophe is the human condition, somebody says. And it's the point where you put the book away for a moment and catch your breath. And then I knew I'd want to write that down and go back to it and think about it. And I guess that's part of what we value about all of Updike's writing, not just this book.
I've studied The Terrorist quite a bit. I'm one of the few Updike scholars who has spent a deeply significant amount of time with that novel. A lot of people, critics and scholars, kind of wrote that book off, but I think again, this is Updike's last standalone novel before he passes, and like The Coup, and I think it's about 30 years later that Terrorist comes out. It's again Updike revisiting some of these same complexities. And it's one of the reasons that I enjoy Terrorist so much is because he's revisiting the ideas of the coup from a more important contemporary position, but asking us once again to reconsider the role of the United States in the world and how it might be different, how it should be held up to a lens of critique when that's appropriate. And so, definitely contemporary aspects to this, and it's wrapped in a lyrical, poetic bow. So it's wonderful.
One of Updike's critics describes his novels as being populated with washed out and corroded souls in a fallen state of grace, and then goes on to say specifically about The Coup that the novel's written with compassion and concern for the subjects it addresses. And I wonder how far those two qualities, the kind of souls in a fallen state of grace, but also the compassion, are those things helpful when it comes to understanding what this novel's driving at, its intentions, do you think?
Definitely. I think it's a trait that Updike returns to again and again. Corroded souls might be a bit much for my taste. I wouldn't use the word corroded. I might say questioning. His characters are looking into an existential abyss or looking for answers in a complex world in which answers aren't easy to come by. And maybe even which I find interesting. His characters are looking for answers in a world in which a lot of people think they have the answer, but those answers are problematic. And that's what I see at the heart of that complexity, because Updike's not telling us to like Ellellou. He's not telling us that we should think one way or the other. It's an open-ended question. This isn't a heroic figure. It's a figure in the midst of a dilemma. And so Ellellou, like people in general, is at a crossroads. He's at a crossroads between old and new, between hope and the heritage that his people have experienced. So he's critical of the West, but also can't deny that he is a product of the time that he spends in the United States and its impact on him. And so Updike's quote unquote heroes or lead characters are often trying to figure out where their individuality begins and ends or falls in a structure that is shakier than it seems, particularly by those whose power influence is centered on upholding that structure. And so I think it's an important way to look at Updike's primary characters, and it's a great framework for thinking about the coup, which is why it fits so well historically into that era, that late 70s era for Updike, which will culminate in the final two books of the Rabbit series, which, are just mind-bogglingly good historical fiction.
I think that there's so much to admire here. One of the particular qualities of this novel is actually the dramatic nature of it. I mean, Updike, he puts his central character in dialogue with so many different people that at times it's almost like watching a stage play, and you're never quite sure which side the author is on. If he has a side, he's actually interested in the interplay of ideas and the dialogue. And I think that's something that's very impressive here in particular, is the kind of moral messiness, even of the narrating voice. As you say, we might conventionally expect to sympathize with such a character, but it's very difficult. The author and the character don't make that easy for us.
Yeah. And I think that from a craft perspective, I think it's really interesting that he frames this as a memoir, potentially even says at the end, is he actually in fact writing a memoir? And then has Ellellou adapting or adopting two different perspectives himself. And so Ellellou is looking at himself and his life as if through a camera lens, like he's watching a documentary or a show about himself, but he's also using first person. So we're able to see what he sees, be inside his head, and also then engage in the dialogue with the other characters. That I love that. I mean, someday I want to copy this in some way and write a novel with the memoir at the center, because I think it's a fascinating use of craft to triangulate ideas, which is Updike's strength. And there were some critics, I'm sure you saw them, that criticized Updike because Ellellou was too intellectual. They say the same thing about Rabbit Angstrom, that Updike takes too much liberty and makes this middle class American sound too much like John Updike would sound. But I would counter that with the idea of, like, he's a novelist. He's writing a novel. I expect when I read John Updike to read a highly intellectual version of whatever the topic is. And that's part of the enjoyment. Is that going to be for everybody? No. But literary fiction isn't meant to be for everybody. Doesn't mean that everybody couldn't learn something, but it's the triangulation of ideas, the complexity in looking at themes that are incredibly complex and triangulated. It's, to me, it's pure genius, both as craft and in execution.
In defense of the novel, I want to say as well that Ellellou, he's well traveled, he's a highly intelligent person, and he's widely read. and he's politically aware and alert. And we haven't touched on this. He's a Marxist and he's a Muslim, and he quotes the Quran throughout and sort of measures people throughout the book according to whether or not they match up to his particular religious ideals. And in that sense, I think it's a novel that's completely true to its character. And I think that the critics you've mentioned didn't quite get that right, weren't quite in tune with what the novel was doing. Now, Jonathan Raban, Anglo-American writer, very much in sympathy with Updike, he said that Updike's work deserves to stand alongside that of Dickens and Thackeray and George Eliot and James Joyce. And I wanted to ask, do you think this is a fair assessment, first of all? And also, how do you think more generally we should remember him?
I definitely think that Updike is incredibly important. In the United States, I mean, it's a global organization. There are global members. There's a John Updike Society. It is a dedicated group of scholars and readers. There's a John Updike review journal on his work. His boyhood home in Pennsylvania has been turned into a museum, and people visit just like they would any other house museum. It's a wonderful showcase of Updike's early life. They have a lot of the pieces from that. His family has donated to the museum, so it's a wonderful place to visit if you're in Reading, PA, or in that area. But the larger question: first, does Updike stand with those people, those great authors, those literary icons, and what should happen next? Is he America's Dickens? That's something that's been asked and tossed around. I would like to think that he is that monumental to American literary history, but I don't think that Updike is anywhere near as widely read as any of the authors that you listed. And it may be because he doesn't have one single great work. When people talk about, even when they name the 100 greatest novels of the 20th century, etc., when Updike makes these lists, which he almost always does, it's for the collection of the Rabbit books, and that's probably 1,000 pages. People aren't reading 1,000-page novel in today's world, not very frequently, and that's as if people are estimating the kind of people that make up these lists, that Rabbit Run alone doesn't make the list, or Rabbit at Rest alone doesn't make the list. So it's interesting. I don't have a crystal ball, but I do know that you're not going to find Updike on the syllabus, at least his novels. Maybe some of his short stories are still taught more widely. I know some sports journalism professors who teach his baseball essay on Ted Williams' last game for the Boston Red Sox. So it's odd where Updike finds his way into teaching, but his novels I don't think are widely read enough to maintain the kind of reputation of the literary icons that you mentioned. I know. What do you think about that?
I think maybe he needs the right kind of advocacy. Perhaps if not everything in the first instance, but if a handful of novels were to be reprinted with new introductions by contemporary writers, that would make a difference. That might do him a favor. And if I could knock the question back to you, what should those handful of great Updike books be if you were in charge of organizing reprints or recommending things to readers? Where should people begin with Updike? I mean, they might want to begin with The Coup. You've made a very strong case for it, or some of the other books you've mentioned. But where is the best place to start if people don't know his work as well as they'd like to?
I would say that, like my beginning with Updike, I would say that you have to go to Rabbit Run. It is a near perfect encapsulation of what was happening in the United States in that time. Just a wonderful book. It's on the short side, so it's accessible to a lot of different kinds of audiences. And then I would say probably this is probably tainted by the fact that I am a diehard Gen Xer, but Rabbit at Rest to me is almost the perfect novel. I mean, it's just absolutely encapsulates the 1980s in a way in the United States that I can't imagine. It's just wonderful. Somebody might start with Terrorist, even though it's Updike's attempt at writing a thriller. I think it's strong and it has resonance today because of the continuing challenges with the Middle East. Some people wouldn't agree with me there. I think that those three would be a good place to start. Updike is such a masterful historian. Historian as novelist, novelist as historian. So I think looking at one of those, what I always lament, because I also happen to have written quite a bit, including a book about Mad Men, the television show. And I often think that if Matthew Weiner, the creator, the showrunner of Mad Men, were to tackle the rabbit tetralogy, that would be the thing that would push Updike into that level, because it seems in the United States, at least, that solidification of reputation must be accompanied in some way by a film or television show. Like that's the final piece of the puzzle. So for me, if I were running Updike's estate, that would be the way that I would go. I would be trying to get Hollywood interest in his work, because if you did a Mad Men version of the Rabbit series and took that Rabbit character from the 60s through the late 80s, early 90s, it would be a wonderful history of the United States with a lot of dramatic elements included. That would be my dream, that somebody is able to pull that off.
Well, what a great idea. I'm feeling excited just by the prospect of it. And I mean, the one that was filmed was, of course, the Witches of Eastwick. And I wonder if you feel that gives a sort of false impression of Updike's work as a whole, if people know that, but they don't know the novels.
Yeah, I think that was so closely tied to Jack Nicholson's personality. And I don't think that Updike had that all that much to do with the actual film. It deviates quite a bit. I think the Witches of Eastwick novel is more haunting. It does mirror in terms of female empowerment. I think Updike was getting tired of people telling him that he didn't write strong women characters, and he decided to show them. There's a touch of that in Updike, and I think the Coup is part of that. He had spent his career writing, what people were sometimes critically calling domestic novels. And I think the Coup was his attempt to show something different. And I think he does that in a lot of later novels. He reacts against criticism by saying essentially, well, you think that you can label me this way, I'll show you that I'm something different. But yeah, I don't think The Witches of Eastwick is a fair representation of something that captures Updike's voice the way that so Matthew Weiner, if you're listening, pick up the Rabbit novels and see if you have another long series in you, because that would be fantastic.
Excellent advice. Thank you. And final question. If you were asked to add another book to Burgess's list of 99 novels, which one would it be? And tell us why.
Sure thing. I just want to thank you for having me on the podcast. It's been fun to revisit Burgess and his thinking. Such a great writer, and so many similarities to Updike. And so it's been fun getting to travel down this road again. So I'm really appreciative. And I'm going to add a novel to Burgess's list of 99, a novelist that I'm not sure if they ever met, but I emailed this novelist to find out if they ever met. But I did it, of course, too late, because we're all busy, and I should have thought of this ahead of time. But my addition is Jerome Charon. He wrote a novel in 1974 called Blue Eyes. And on the surface, it's a hard boiled detective novel. It's part of the Isaac Siddell series that Charon published. But like Burgess's own work, it doesn't stay in its lane. It reimagines the tropes of noir fiction. It is full of lyricism, text as music. And both Burgess and Charon see writing voice as music. Charon talks quite frequently about writing as music and hearing his music. In Blue Eyes, Charon's New York is dystopian. It's corrupt, chaotic. It also captures the 1970s in New York City, which was a very different New York City than the kind of Disney version that you get today. Isaac Siddell, the lead character, is a haunted, mythic figure. And Charon is, like Burgess, obsessed with language. And so I would love to know if they ever met, because Charon taught at Princeton. He taught at other universities. He then later went to France and founded the film department at the American University in Paris. He's still writing today. His latest novel, which is called Maria la Divina, it's a historical fiction about the life of Maria Callas. Charon is called by American novelist Michael Chabon as one of the most important literary figures in American history. And he's a mentor to me and a friend and somebody I admire, whose writing has changed mine dramatically. And he's never searched for the spotlight. So he is not as famous. He's, in fact, much more famous in France than he is in the United States. But he is now 89 years old, publishing wonderful works. And so Blue Eyes would be and I think Burgess would smile about that.
I'm sure he would. And what a great recommendation. Listen, it's been a pleasure to meet you and to talk to you. I've made so many notes. You've sent me away with a book list, and that's a great gift. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Andrew.
You've been listening to 99 Novels, a podcast by the International Anthony Burgess Foundation. John Updike, a critical biography by Bob Batchelor, is available now. For more information about Anthony Burgess and the work of the Burgess Foundation, visit anthonyburgess.org. You can subscribe to the Burgess Foundation's free weekly newsletter at anthonyburgessfoundation.substack.com.